2021, and we are noticed from 3:30 to 4 p.m. today. Madam Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, Madam Chair. Mr. Weddleton? Ms. Allard?
Here.
Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Mr. Rivera?
Present.
Ms. Kennedy?
Here.
Ms. Grant?
Here.
Mr. Constant?
Here.
Ms. Zolotel?
Here.
Mr. Dunbar?
Here.
Mr. Presbytia?
Here.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Here.
Mr. Weddleton?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. We'll go ahead and do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. Dunbar, would you read the land acknowledgement?
Yes, Madam Clerk. I'm sorry, Madam Chair. A land acknowledgement is a formal statement recognizing the indigenous people of a place. It is a public gesture of appreciation for the past and present indigenous stewardship of the lands we now occupy. It is an actionable statement that marks our collective movement towards decolonization and equity. The Anchorage Assembly would like to acknowledge that we gather today on the traditional lands of the Dena'ina Athabascans. For thousands of years, the Dena'ina have been and continue to be the stewards of this land. It is with gratefulness and respect that we recognize the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspectives of the Upper Coquitlam Dena'ina. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. I want to just go back a step, and for folks on the phone, if those members of the Assembly or administration would identify themselves. And we'll start with you, Mr. Gates.
Yes, Dean Gates is in the council, and I have an interpreter, Gina Ashby, with me.
And I'm Bill Falsey. I'm appearing today in my role as retained outside counsel for the Assembly.
And from the clerk's office.
Jennifer Mendenhausen, Deputy Municipal Clerk.
Desiree Camacho, Assembly Budget Analyst.
Travis Turner, Minutes Clerk.
And from the Assembly.
Mayor Ross, Secretary Assembly Legislative Liaison.
And the administration.
Alexis Johnson, Mayor's DA.
Thank you. We have 2 items of business on our agenda today. The first item, 4A, Assembly Action on Mayoral Veto of AO 2021-92S, an ordinance of the Anchorage Assembly amending Anchorage Municipal Code sections 2.30.095 and 3.20.020 and chapter 3.30 regarding mayoral appointments to principal, executive, or department head positions and assembly confirmation from the continued assembly meeting of November 10, 2021. What is the will of the body?
Move to override.
Second.
A motion to override the veto has been made by Mr. Constant and seconded.
Madam Clerk, Madam Chair, which item are we taking up first?
4A, which is AO 2021-92S concerning confirmations. So motion to override the veto of AO 2021-92S has been made by Mr. Constant and seconded by Mr. Dunbar. Assembly Council is in the queue. Mr. Gates.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So we have a veto message from the mayor as required by charter in writing. And I guess we should speak to some of the legal points he made. And I'd like Mr. Foss have to speak to this.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Mr. Falsey.
Through the chair, this is Bill Falsey, outside counsel for the Assembly. Speaking to AO 2021-92S related to the confirmation process. Because the Assembly's vote to be helpful to set the table a bit. The ordinance, of course, related to the municipal section of the section of Municipal Charter 502, which provides that the mayor shall appoint all heads of municipal departments, subject to confirmation by the Assembly on the basis of professional qualifications. As the Assembly knows, in the last decade or so, that process has been increasingly formalized in the About 10 years ago in the L.B. Gray Jackson, Dick Cheney era, we only began doing assembly work sessions or confirmation hearings. In 2019, you adopted a code provision which newly required the administration to send an appointment memorandum to the assembly so that you could trigger the confirmation vote in assembly chambers.
And Mr. Falsey, there's a request online if you could move closer to the mic. Apology for the interruption. And if folks on the line could please mute.
See if that is any better. 2021-92S simply proposed to further formalize this process and does so without changing the ability of the mayor to appoint whomever he or she would wish to have any of these appointed positions. And it principally addressed two gaps in the code. And that is, what happens if a person is actually appointed by the mayor, but never forwarded to the assembly for confirmation? And second, what should happen if a person is hired into a job that does not require assembly confirmation, but then indefinitely given the powers of a person who should receive assembly confirmation? And here, the ordinance answered that when an actual appointment is made, it must be forwarded to the assembly within 60 days. And likewise, it prescribes some reasonable limits for how long a person could be acting in a position that would otherwise necessitate a mayoral appointment, with some reasonable exceptions to deal with standard issues that have arisen in the municipality in previous days. I note that the mayor's veto message included the claim that this ordinance would allow the assembly to make its own determination of when the mayor intended to appoint someone for a position. That to me is just a misreading of the ordinance. There is no scenario in which the assembly says we deem a person to have been appointed that was not. And I'm happy to answer questions if there are any other members.
Thank you, Mr. Falsey. If members have any questions, please put yourself in the queue. I will pause here just to give members an opportunity to text me. Okay, I do not see anyone in the queue. Seeing no one in the queue, I'll pass the gavel to Mr. Dunbar. And I just want to add that Mr. Rivera and I had brought forward the AO in 2019 that, as Mr. Falsey said, formalized the confirmation hearing process, and that this AO 2021-92S is legal and conforms with the charter. It addresses gaps in the process and helps ensure that the assembly can properly exercise its duty to confirm mayoral appointees that are subject to assembly confirmation.
So, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Seeing no other members in the queue, members may proceed to vote on the motion to override the mayoral veto of AO 2021-92S. Madam Clerk, would you conduct the vote, please?
Yes, Madam Chair. Mr. Weddleton? Mr. Weddleton, how do you vote?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Allard?
No.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Rivera?
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy?
No.
Ms. LaFrance?
Yes.
Mr. Constant?
Yes.
There's an
Ms.
email for you to
Sullivan?
approve a contract.
Yes.
You can see that. Took some tweaks too.
Someone's unmuted.
Please be sure to mute.
And we do want to, is there anything else that you'd like us
Would folks
to
please
do?
mute?
Mr. Dunbar?
Yes.
Mr. Perez Revilla?
Yes.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yes.
Madam Chair, that passes 9-2.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. We now have before us item 4B, Assembly Action on Mayoral Veto of AO 2021-113S, an ordinance of the Anchorage Assembly amending Anchorage Municipal Code to codify management authority over assembly premises and regarding use of municipal resources by the assembly to ensure that the assembly may safely, efficiently, and effectively conduct business from the continued assembly meeting of November 10, 2021. What is the will of the body?
Move to override.
Move to override.
Second.
A motion to override the mayoral veto of AO 2021-113S has been made by Mr. Constant and seconded by Mr. Dunbar. And I just want to note for the record too that Mr. Weddleton is now in the room, and then a comment also from a member online that there's been a lot of background noise on the phone, and if folks could remember to please mute. Now we'll go to Assembly Council.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I would also like to have Mr. Fossick speak on the issues raised in Mayor's veto memorandum.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to the chair. Again, this is Bill Falsey. On the subject of ordinance AO 2021-113S, the ordinance clarifies and codifies really some longstanding municipal practices related to assembly meetings and workspaces. It might be important to clarify at the outset that it doesn't make any changes to municipal reporting structures or to existing chains of command. It is really intended to codify the prevailing understanding of the relative responsibilities and powers to exercise between the municipality's legislative and executive branches for the past 45 years, and ultimately to ensure that the assembly simply can reliably conduct its own business. The charter says that the chair is the presiding officer of assembly meetings. In order for the chair to exercise her legal order and decorum in the chambers, he or she must have the resources available to her or him to make that, have to exercise those powers and duties responsibly. The mayor's veto message, interestingly, cites to certain provisions of law of Alaska statute, state law 29, 220, 250, and 500. In our view, Assembly Council's view, my own view, those provisions, two of those provisions simply don't apply. And the veto message is based on a misreading of state law. As you all know, the municipality of Anchorage is a home rule municipality. And as our Alaska Supreme Court has said, it therefore has all legislative powers not prohibited by law or charter. In deciding whether the state has limited the powers of a home rule municipality, the court looks for prohibitions, not grants of power. As it turns out, the Alaska State Legislature has made it actually pretty easy to figure out what prohibitions apply to us. There is a provision of state law, Alaska Statute 29-10-200, limitation of home rule powers, which provides that only the following provisions of this title apply to home rule municipalities as prohibitions on acting otherwise than as provided. And the two provisions I mentioned here, 250 and 500, are simply not listed there. It's my understanding that in order for the administration to arrive at a conclusion that they might apply to the municipality, you have to go to section 220, read an or as an and then follow a chain of two cross-references, ultimately to arrive at a conclusion that the mayor is the custodian and has custody of the physical and real property of the municipality. Even if that were a correct read of state law, which again I would say it is not, it misunderstands the concept of being the custodian of municipal property. We know that being entrusted with custody of real and personal property does not mean an unfettered right to do whatever you want to do with that property. And we know that for a variety of reasons. Both the municipality and state law say that, for instance, the municipal clerk is the custodian of the municipal seal, but the municipal clerk is not entitled to do anything with the municipal seal. She must act in accordance with the guidance given by the legislature and codified in law. In the same manner, the responsibility of a custodian of real or personal property would have to exercise that custodial responsibility in accordance with provisions provided by law. I think one example that may help clarify this is the chair's gavel is the personal property of the municipality. I don't think it would be a fair construction of our law to say that the mayor may exercise authority over how the gavel can be used. So for those reasons, I am convinced that the ordinance is a perfectly lawful piece of legislation that really brings us back to the old status quo ante and codifies a provision, an understanding that has prevailed for most of the municipality's timeline.
Thank you, Mr. Falsey. Do members have any questions? Mr. Weddleton?
It's not a question, could it be comment or?
Yes, actually, go ahead.
Oh, I just, on this one, it's surprising to me to be called, where it's labeled a power grab. And, I've got a fourplex in a commercial building, a couple that I rent, and, I own the buildings and so I have control, but I would never think that my tenants don't have the right to decide when they work, what they do, and so on. And it really seems to be this situation where the executive branch may be in charge of the buildings, but they can't tell us everything that they do and control that. So it's surprising to me that this is even objected to. It's very, very normal in the normal course of business. And, you rent the place, you let people use it. It's largely what we're doing here, except we have this nice feature where we say 5 stations, which I think is important, but it's always like, we'll always have room at the table for you to come to dinner. So.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I'm still trying to figure out what this really does. And it seems to me that what Mr. Falsey is saying is this really doesn't change anything. However, having taken that philosophy, I guess, on it, I'm trying to figure out from a practical standpoint what it really means for the assembly to have management authority and what responsibilities then go with that authority. So you might be able to make the argument that the mayor is kind of a misunderstanding that he has just custodial duties there, but then actually that really is the question then, does that the assembly now has that requirement or that duty or that responsibility? I mean, does that mean that the assembly now has to make the arrangements for cleaning the facility, for making arrangements for people that want to use the facility? There are other groups that do. We have commissions that do. The local Anchorage delegation from the state legislature uses it. So anyway, I'm still trying to figure out just from a practical standpoint what that authority does. Because one of the things that I think is really critical is to understand that when you have authority over something, you also have responsibility for it, and vice versa. You can't attempt to take responsibility for something if you don't have authority over it. So anyway, I would, rather than just having an explanation of why the mayor might have a misunderstanding of state code, I would rather have a better explanation of, practically speaking, what that means in terms of the assembly's new responsibility if we now have this new management authority. Thank you. And I hope that was clear to hear that, because I get a lot of garbledness from other people that I hear speaking. So if I need to repeat something, I'm happy to do that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. You came through very clearly. Mr. Falsey, would you?
Yes, through the chair to Assemblymember Kennedy, I think I could begin to answer that by quoting from the language of the ordinance itself. Their management authority is a defined term, and it shall mean control over the physical and logistical arrangements of the premises for use of the space, including furnishings, equipment, technology, security, seating arrangements, attendance, and occupancy limits, which may be more but not less restrictive, but those are required by Title 23, which is fire code. Special safety measures or orders, accessibility accommodations, signage, decor, and other personal property and operational matters, as the president says. My understanding is that the intent of the maker, as is further outlined in the associated memorandum, is that gives the presiding officer the ability to control those things which are necessary to run the meeting. So that if you gave a direction to the municipal clerk to work with the IT department to display something on the Granicus system, that would happen. If security needed to be involved in helping to manage the chambers, that would happen. It is not an intent, I think, I know, to fully take over all responsibilities for the space, and that's clear for two reasons. The first is, even in the designation of management authority in section 2, there we say the mayor has management authority over assembly premises to the extent that it's not inconsistent with that which has been granted to the assembly chair in section 1. Meaning the assembly is not interested in being on call to fix plumbing problems or when the HVAC system needs to be serviced. And that's made clear in the assembly memorandum. It just has been the municipality's practice for decades that the legislative branch has not created its own facilities maintenance, custodial, IT contracts, and it would be sort of needlessly duplicative to do that. This is really just designed to say the assembly has the prerogative to conduct its business in a manner that has been the manner that has prevailed for decades.
Madam Chair, a quick point of order.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Constant.
I move to extend the meeting to 4:15.
Second.
The motion to extend to 4:15 has been made by Mr. Constant and seconded by Mr. Weddleton. Seeking unanimous consent, is there any opposition? Hearing none, we are extended to 4:15. We'll go back to Ms. Kennedy for any follow-up on Mr. Falsey's comments.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Then I do feel like we're kind of back to square one in terms of this doesn't really change anything. So maybe maybe I'm okay with that. But again, I think the question is what this really means in terms of what the assembly or the clerk's office responsibility is. But I will ask Mr. Falsey, do you think we would have been better served to have some kind of memorandum of understanding, something that was more of a negotiated agreement about this, just to understand exactly what everyone's role should be in this? And because that's really my question is, again, going back to why we need this, and I would argue that we don't need it, but I'm just wondering if you thought that there was maybe a better way to come to an understanding of what everyone's authority, role, and responsibility should be, and if we could have to work that out would have probably been more productive and would actually have helped us to come to some clearer answers about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Mr. Falsey?
And through the chair to Assembly Member Kennedy, I'll answer that by saying, of course, it is always better when parties can agree on division of authority, who's in charge of what. This ordinance, I think, sets the appropriate rules of the road and the accurate baseline, but of course it doesn't prevent further memorandum of agreement sitting on top of it, where if the administration and assembly leadership wanted to come to more particularized understandings about exactly how seating arrangements or the IT system or live streaming of the municipal meetings should work, nothing about this ordinance precludes that from happening.
Thank you, Mr. Falsey. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Falsey. I appreciate that. And I think with that in mind, that's one of the reasons why I'm not going to support the overriding of the veto, because I think we are still leaving a lot of questions on the table, a lot of complications and conflicts and confusion that this ordinance creates and doesn't actually help us solve the problem. And I think we're still going to have issues with potentially having arguments, if you will, over this without that memorandum of understanding. So I will be opposing the override. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. We'll go to Mr. Constant and then Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Constant?
I have no doubt that an effort was made to work through the differences before coming to the point where an ordinance had to be drafted, introduced, passed, vetoed, and now the question of overriding is before us. Why? Because for the first time in the 46-year history of the municipality, a mayor has asserted he has the power to set the time, place, and manner of an assembly meeting. They have argued that's not what they have done. Of course, we've heard those arguments. We've heard them ad nauseum. But when we sat down to try to negotiate these items, they always came back to the same point. It was their right to assert how we meet. This ordinance is intended to establish clearly in the code, the long history and practice of every mayor of this municipality. And yes, Mr. Falsey is right. We can move forward and come up with further definitions through memorandums of agreement. But if not, then we have a remedy before us that we may have to avail ourselves of, which is not the desirable remedy, but the administration may not interfere with the Assembly's authority to operate its own branch.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. We'll go next to Mr. Weddleton and then Ms. Allard. Mr. Weddleton?
Thanks, sorry, I have a couple of points. One, you know, I had talked to Larry Baker and Craig Campbell about this, seems like a month or so ago. And I don't know if they spoke as authority, you know, with the mayor, but, you know, their biggest concern, they said when they saw this, was that it didn't make clear that the executive had space there in a meeting. I see that's addressed in part 4 here, section 1. So that, and I, okay, so it's like they thought that was a big issue and that was taken care of. But I do have a question, maybe this is a Dean question, is I don't think this mayor would do something it's childish, but we're a mayor to say, okay, if you have control, then you pay the electricity, you get your cleaning crew in there and so on. Is that something that the Assembly could just vote to change the budget anytime, you know, mid-year or something like that, and then allocate money to the Assembly to take care of those things?
Mr. Gates?
Well, Mr. Wilson, I think that partly what you're asking is for a look at a crystal ball as to what behavior we can anticipate. And I agree with what you opened with. I wouldn't anticipate that kind of action taking place where they say the electrical bill is now going to be someone's budget. Real property ownerships in the municipality as a whole, our maintenance and operations department, I believe, sort of monitors and takes care of, you know, electricity and stuff like that. And as Mr. Falsey read at the beginning, we tried to craft a definition for premises and management authority, so it's narrow enough to exclude those kind of things. It's just for use of the means for the presiding officers there to preside over the use of the space for an assembly meeting or legislative function. And perhaps Mr. Falsey would like to add anything to your question, if that's all right.
Mr. Falsey?
That's through the chair to Assemblymember Weldon. I agree with everything that Assembly Council said. It is the case that we tried to leave in place in the ordinance the underlying responsibilities of having the executive be in charge of those kinds of HVAC, plumbing, custodial, janitorial services, because we said that the management authority rested with the executive just to the extent not inconsistent with that which had been granted to the Assembly. And that reflects the sort of shared ownership and shared control that has been prevailing in the Assembly for a very long time. Now, if it were to pass, then an executive were to say, that's it, I am no longer providing essential services to that space because this ordinance has passed. I think there would be a first question of whether that is even lawful. The Assembly is still directed, that legislated, that authority has to be exercised reasonably by the executive. But formally, the answer to your particular question is yes, the Assembly can always amend budgets and reappropriate funds. So if there is money that is now sitting in the maintenance and operations budget, it could be picked up and reappropriated to the Assembly department. That would cause a number of contract questions. And certainly it is not a path that I think anyone is hoping that the Assembly or the executive has to go down.
Yeah, it'd be crazy to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Thank you, Mr. Falsey and Mr. Gates. Ms. Allard?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to also mention that this is the first time in history that the Assembly has ever been sued by violating the Open Meetings Act when we had control over the chambers. This is the first time in history that the Assembly hasn't worked to compromise. So I just wanted to repeat that I don't believe this is legal and that I will be a solid no vote. I think that part of the compromise would have been to better communicate with the administration, better communicate with the public, and not lock them out. And I think that's one of the things that alarm me, is that we have locked out the community to afford testimony, regardless of the situation. We back
Ms. Allard,
about a year ago.
please speak to the motion before us.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm done speaking.
Thank you, Ms. Allard. And Mr. Constant?
Thank you. Just a final note, I reject any argument that there wasn't an effort to compromise made, because there was. And there were ongoing efforts right up until the final introduction of the final item.
Ordered. Why doesn't he speak to the topic as well?
I did, that there was compromise. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Allard. And yes, Mr. Constant was referring to the point that was raised earlier regarding compromise and an MOU and an MOA, or an MOA. Seeing no other members in the queue, I'll hand the gavel to Mr. Dunbar and speak briefly that I agree with Mr. Weddleton on the points he raised, and I don't think anyone expected or anticipated that this kind of ordinance would be needed, especially after 45 years of customs and traditions. And I just want to reiterate that this ordinance merely ensures that the assembly has what it needs to effectively run its meetings, which is critical for doing the city's business, the municipality's business. And it does not do anything more than codify practices, as we've discussed, that have been in place for over 45 years. It's legal and it conforms with the charter. And I do look forward as a member of assembly leadership to working with the administration on collaborative steps forward, improving communication, and exploring an MOU or MOA or whatever is needed to move forward. Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Okay, seeing no other members in the queue, members may proceed to vote on the motion to override the mayoral veto of AO 2021-113S. Madam Clerk, would you conduct the vote, please?
Yes, Madam Chair. Mr. Weddleton?
Yes.
Ms. Allard?
No.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Rivera?
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy?
No.
Ms. LaFrance?
Yes.
Mr. Constant?
Yes.
Ms. Volatil?
Yes.
Mr. Dunbar?
Yes.
Mr. Perez-Revilla?
Yes.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yes.
That motion passes 9-2.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. It is 4:08 and we have extended to 4:15. So we have time for audience participation. Are there any members of the public who wish to participate? If so, please come forward. You will have 3 minutes. Please state your name for the record. I'll wave my hand when you have 30 seconds left, and please direct your comments to members of the assembly.
Where's best to stand, Ms. Chair?
What do you think, Madam Clerk, for the microphone?
I think Mr. Williams maybe center would be.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. And if you go ahead and start by stating your name for the record and the area of town in which you live, I'll go ahead and start the timer.
Niall Sherwood Williams, District 3. See that neither of my members. I'd like to first address to this body that it was noted on the record that Mr. Weddleton walked in. For the record, Mr. Weddleton walked in after the vote for the first override was completed. So I would like to make a note for the record that it's potential that the Open Meetings Act may have been violated today by only having 2 members physically present on this body. As well, I would like to ask for the record why members of this body were communicating on their cellular telephones during and throughout the vote. Are you communicating, asking questions to legal counsel outside of the record? Or are you communicating amongst yourselves, or are you talking about what you're going to eat for dinner tonight? But none of those actions are appropriate, and it certainly does not look good from the public looking on. Respectfully, the second vote is the most egregious of the 2. because it deals with that you're taking power that you don't have. And you can state that it's lawful and that it's legal as many times as you like. Doesn't change the facts. Executive branch explicitly runs the government. And for the record, through the chair, Member Constant, this municipality was formed in 1959. I got the original charter in my backpack. The first ordinance as well, it's kind of a clown show that you now want to establish 60 days as the temporary appointment role. When you, despite me suing you in Superior Court and the clerk for the unlawful acting mayor, AQD, Austin Quinn Davidson, who served as the unlawful acting mayor for 180 days. That's the reason why you want to have that. Again, stop the infighting, take yourselves to federal court. We're done. The municipality is bankrupt. Reveal the truth. Stop lying to the people. In Jesus' name, resign now.
Thank you for your participation. Are there any other members of the public who wish to participate? Seeing and hearing no one else, we will move on to assembly comments, and I will start with the members on the phone. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. No comment.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Ms. Allard?
No comment.
Thank you, Ms. Allard. Ms. Zelatel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. No comment.
Thank you, Ms. Zelatel. Mr. Rivera?
Thank you, Madam Chair. No comment.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Mr. Perez-Verdia? Mr. Perez-Verdia? Ms. Kennedy?
No comment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Nothing from me, thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. Such an interesting comment from the member of the public that's verifiably inaccurate. 1975 is when the municipality was incorporated. The state of Alaska was granted statehood in 1959. The city of Anchorage started in 1915, 1916. Not sure when the greater Anchorage area borough was organized, but neither the city of Anchorage nor the greater Anchorage area borough exist any longer because the municipality became its governing unit in 1975. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Weddleton?
No comment, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. No comment.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Did I get everybody? I think so. That brings us to adjournment.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
We are adjourned. Thank you all for coming.